Commissioner Lenarčič, thank you very much for this insights and inspiring words. It is now my pleasure to hand over the first panel to the moderator, Mr. Thomas Seifert. He is the Deputy Editor-in-Chief of the Wiener Zeitung, and for the first panel, and also his co-panelists, as well as Commissioner Lenarčič for a first round of questions and remarks. Thomas, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thanks a lot. Thank you so much. I wish you could be having the same view that we enjoy here from the panel to look into this wonderful audience. Good morning, everybody. We are starting right off here with the panel. The humanitarian imperative is non-negotiable. It was stated in both the keynotes that we had and also your statement. And that's where we wanted to start, to set the foundation of this day today, because unfortunately it seems forgotten in some quarters that there is an imperative and that it is non-negotiable. But first I want to introduce my panelists, and I won't only say that if there is a humanitarian need in the world, I think you want my panelists or the institutions they represent to be there, because then you can rest assured that at least somebody's doing something. So let's start with you, Mervat. Her institution is, you can look it up, it's like the usual alphabet soup of the UN with a lot of acronyms. But Mervat is representing the United Nations office, and she has a great experience in humanitarian work. And of course, you want the UN to be there to help. Next, Klaus is sitting there. Another acronym alphabet soup of, in this case, the Europeans. But let's put it there. The European Union is one of the biggest assistants in humanitarian affairs, and you want also the institution that Klaus represents and represented to be there to help you. On the other end of my panel, there's Christou from Médecins Sans Frontières, and as you all know, if the beep hits the fan, then these guys are on the front lines of where it's happening. You also want them to be there. So Christos, thanks that you are here as well. And finally, we have Ariane. Ariane Bauer is representing the ICRC. She, again, like everybody else on this panel, has been in all the wrong places. And if the ICRC is not there, you know you're in serious trouble. And finally, of course, again, and it's great that Janez has been quite undiplomatic in some of the statements. I'm very happy about that. And the European Union, we all know, is there. And one thing is also, you mentioned the Security Council, with maybe a few exceptions. Most of the European Union members, and one of them that was the exception, Britain, has been involved in active wars that have not been sanctioned by the UN Charter, and as we know, Britain is no longer part of the European Union. So it has been, for more or less, a force for good, at least more than the other Security Council members that you mentioned. So let's start with our discussion, and maybe first we want to reflect on what you have been saying, Janez, and Mervat, may I ask you to be the first one to reflect on what's been said.
Thank you, Thomas, and good morning to the colleagues here in the room and those also online. And really a big thank you to the conveners of this year's Congress, and for convening this wide variety of stakeholders, not only just to have a dialogue and a debate around the persistent and the pertinent challenges that we're facing as a humanitarian community, ultimately to service and support vulnerable communities around the world, but also to think of solutions to the challenges that we're facing together on the ground. A big thank you also to the Minister, for very much agree with your remarks, Minister, as well as the Commissioner, and very much appreciate some of the very provocative also comments that you've shared. And a big thank you also to the government of Austria for increasing the humanitarian contributions, including also in terms of increasing the climate funding contributions as well. I think the first point, perhaps, that I would say is there are no humanitarian solutions to political problems or to political crises. This is an issue and a theme that has been echoed by the previous speakers. It is critical for us to diminish and reduce humanitarian needs to find political solutions to political crises that are confronting the world. To give you an example, I mean, in addition to the serious challenges around protection of civilians, just in DRC alone, there are 78,000 cases of gender-based violence that have been reported in 2022. There are challenges there because there is impunity, despite violations, despite disregard to international humanitarian law and international human rights law. There are no consequences. There is no accountability to the perpetrators. These are issues that humanitarians cannot address. Hence the importance of partnering and collaborating and mastering the art of humanitarian diplomacy to be able to address these issues. I couldn't also agree with you, Minister, in terms of also addressing the root causes of conflict, but also needs. In many of the contexts that we're operating, there are developmental needs, there are economic needs that need to be tackled as a matter of priority. And again, I was happy to hear the Commissioner also speaking about the nexus, the humanitarian development and peace nexus, because there is a need to ensure there is a collective and collaborative way to address these issues. The issue of empathy and compassion is absolutely critical. We all have our respective roles as individuals and as professionals to lend a helping hand to those in need. And part of that is also the responsibility sharing aspect of countries around the world, not only neighboring countries where there are conflict, and again, huge appreciation to countries such as Turkey and DRC and others who have opened their borders and accepted and integrated refugees in their territory, as well as the host communities. So the issue of burden responsibility or responsibility sharing is absolutely critical, and that is where I very much count on your and many of those online to ensure that this is achieved. Maybe I'll stop here, Thomas.
Mervat, thank you so much. Christos, maybe you want to join in here?
Yes. First of all, thank you very much for this, and it is the right moment to have this conversation. We woke up all this morning and we see how many victims, more victims coming out from the waters, the seas in the Mediterranean. And this makes me wonder, where is humanity in the agenda of Europe and of the world? And I want to thank Commissioner a lot for setting up the scene and putting the right things. Thanks for stealing my talking points, actually, because indeed I would like to discuss access today. I would like to discuss the respect of the international humanitarian law. We have several examples that I can bring to you from the top of our heads these days. It's Sudan, it was Ukraine. We still negotiate access to those places occupied by the Russian army. In Ukraine, it was also difficult to negotiate and negotiate our principles, the principle of impartiality and neutrality. And many times we felt like everyone wants to manipulate this humanitarian aid. And then the Commissioner mentioned how important is, next to the respect of the humanitarian law, to understand also that there are several parts of this warfare, like the sexual violence, the starvation, and I would add also the attack to the medical care. This seems to be not a ripple effect or an unintended, an accidental incident. It is part of a strategy, and we experience attacks to our medical facilities more and more in most of the places where we intervene in conflicts. We also mentioned that there is a shrinkage in the humanitarian funding. And we see that not only in conflicts, we see that also in protracted crises, like in South Sudan. The reduce of the humanitarian funds that we had by the donor countries, and of course, do not affect MSF, because thanks to these 7 million donors, we are completely independent. But we see other partners of ours or other organizations and international agencies that they cannot do their job. And then it affects also our job, and actually it affects the population. So this is also very important to understand that what discussion we have today about humanitarian imperatives happens in this environment. And to me, and I will close it here, yes, indeed, the must-haves and saving lives is a priority and it's not negotiable, but we have to negotiate for that every day. We have to negotiate access with both of the state and non-state armed groups. We have to negotiate that we are not enemies when we treat the patients of the enemy. We have to negotiate our identity, our principles, our impartiality. And if there is from somewhere that we need to start, it's from there, that these things have to become non-negotiable.
Thank you. Ariane, one of the problems also is that this impartiality is more and more questioned by, for instance, in conflict areas where basically even humanitarian organizations, for instance, like the Red Cross, also like MSF, are even targeted in some cases. And it sometimes seems that the warring parties sometimes make it especially hard, as Christos just said, to even get access to areas and so on. What's happened and how can we, we're talking here about the humanitarian imperative, so how can we get back that these rules are widely accepted? Can they be enforced? What can we do?
That's a tough question. Can they be enforced? I think, in the end, we are all soft powers. All humanitarian actors are soft powers. Most of us don't carry physical security when we're in the field. This is what we do because we want the proximity to the people that we are there to help. We need to be respected by them, we need to be trusted by them. And here I'm talking also by those who are carrying weapons. And I think that I think all of us spend a lot of time in building those relations on the ground, in negotiating access, in explaining what we do. But it's not only about talking. In the end, it's really about delivering, bringing what is needed to those in need, so that we can really also demonstrate our relevance. I think that's something we hear a lot in the field. You come, you assess, you look, you talk, you ask questions, and then what? And that's perhaps the link then also to the funding question, because as humanitarians we need to be rapid in responding. There are ways to respond that are faster than others. Indeed, if you can do cash assistance, that's usually faster than having to roll out big logistic pipelines. But for that we need the flexibility in order when violence hits, that we are in a position to be responsive from day one, ideally. And in order to do that, it takes a presence, oftentimes already before violence hits. It takes a presence, it takes building relations, creating understanding for what we do, creating understanding also for the fact that we are all neutral, impartial, that we will help people on all sides, that this is not negotiable, and that space is really needed. Otherwise, we unfortunately fail.
And Klaus, the humanitarian imperative was there a long time ago, and even in biblical times, it was help thy neighbor, love thy neighbor. And if I look at the European Union, it seems that we have a lot of neighbors, because we have Africa, a whole continent, with a lot of need. We have another neighbor, Ukraine. It has been stated where there's an active war going on with tragedies every day. And if we compare it to, for instance, the United States, they don't have to worry too much about Canada, right? It's like Switzerland is a neighbor that is quite, at the moment we have even climate-related issues with the fires, but Canada is easy. But Mexico, of course, Latin America, Central America, different question. But how do we deal with Europe that has a lot of responsibility? We heard about the responsibility, and we have a lot of responsibility because we are in a neighborhood that frankly needs Europe to look what's going on. And even the French would state that, well, even the Pacific region is our neighborhood because there's island states there. So how do we deal with this responsibility that we have?
I believe the recent tragedy in Greece has put the neighborhood very close to us. What is going on the north coast of Africa is part of our destiny. And if we don't get to these issues in a very serious way, we will face innumerable more disasters. I believe also what is going on in Ukraine is a profound tragedy in our proximity. So no wonder that Europe is deeply concerned about what happens. What I really worry about is that the proximity takes away the attention of what goes on in sub-Saharan Africa or in Tuvalu because of the climate deregulation. Because Europe has to project its values way beyond the proximity. When we're faced with climate deregulation, we are actually faced also with a governance, a global governance deregulation. You, the Commissioner, referred to the UN Security Council. And we have to brace ourselves for a situation where these institutions, of which Mervat is a proud servant, break down and do not have sufficient support. And I see a lot of youngsters here. Be aware of disturbances in the global governance system, because this is what we have. And humanity has, in the past, gone through very dark periods. And the good news is that at the end of the dark tunnel, there has been light. We have to prepare ourselves for the light to come. We have to think about future governance models. That would not be for me, it would be for you, because you're a bit younger. So I count on you to watch out and prepare ourselves for that. Let me add one point on the fundamental principles. They actually exist, and this gives me hope. They exist in all great world civilizations. In Islam, in Hinduism, in Taoism, in the Christian, etc., even atheists, because they have some morality. We share the need to help each other, to help the orphan, to help the person lost in the desert, etc. This is deeply human. We just have to connect the dots and make sure we link up, all of us, around the globe. Interdependence is a reality. So there's a big issue here that we should not forget while we are in the middle of the Ukraine crisis or the food crisis in sub-Saharan Africa. Over.
Yeah, thank you, Klaus, to remind us that empathy is deeply human, and I think we should also bear that in mind on our panel here. You said something also, I think, very important, that the poly-crisis might kind of, first of all, blind us, in a sense, just to focus on the crisis that's right in front of us. And maybe, Janis, I want to ask you how we deal with that as Europeans, because obviously, of course, even from Austria, it's just a night on the train to be in Lviv. It's just a whole day on the train to be in Kyiv, another half day to be in Kharkiv, and then a few hours on your car, and you're already in the middle of the war. So how do we deal with what Klaus just said? Yes, Ukraine is a pressing problem. Yes, it's our neighborhood. Yes, it's a security threat even for the European Union, but there is so many other problems that also we have responsibility. How do we deal with that?
Well, I go back to what I said at the beginning, that I like the term global responsibility. Humanitarian needs, wherever they appear in the world, are a global responsibility, shared responsibility. And everybody who is in a position to help is obliged to help. That's my case. And this, who are these? Obviously, it's all the entire developed world. But also, I would add some more, including some of those that still cling to their status formally as developing countries, but this status was perhaps accurate 30 or 40 years ago, and it's no longer the case because now they sit on a mountain of cash, and they should do more than they are doing. I guess you know whom I have in mind. But the word global has another meaning. European Union is very proud of being global and principled humanitarian donor. What does it mean? The principled part means that we act strictly in accordance with the humanitarian principles of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence. How does that look in practice? For instance, to illustrate with Ukraine, EU is not neutral and impartial as far as Russian aggression in Ukraine is concerned. We are firmly on the side of Ukraine. We support the Ukrainian government. We help them defend the country against this illegal criminal invasion and so on. But in humanitarian aid, we fund all projects to address all the needs wherever they may be. No matter who controls the territory, no matter who is on whose side. So our humanitarian aid is completely impartial. So this is the principal part. The global donor part means we treat every humanitarian need and every person affected by a humanitarian crisis equally. Equally. For us, lives in Africa are as important as lives in Europe. No difference whatsoever. And I always proudly insist that even though we now have a war on our own continent, right next to us, next door, so to say. From Austria, the first border control that you encounter when you drive to east will be on Ukrainian border. But even in the case when we are dealing with a brutal war right next door in our immediate neighborhood, we have not taken any euro from any other humanitarian crisis anywhere else in the world and diverted it to Ukraine. Not a single one. On the contrary, in a number of cases where humanitarian needs went up last year, like Yemen, like South Sudan, we increased our humanitarian aid also there. So this means, this is the meaning of being a global and principled humanitarian donor, and we are very much proud of being that. And we encourage also all EU member states to act likewise. There is another important reason why we do so. Our world today is small. It's not what it was 100 or more years ago. Now what happens at the other end of the world does affect us too. So the term of neighborhood should be re-evaluated, and in my view, the entire planet is nowadays our neighborhood.
Mervat, what also Klaus has said is that he fears that basically the whole rules-based order, global order, is under threat. And of course, that would be very bad news, because one of the custodians of this rules-based order after World War II was the United Nations. Do you see the risk? Is what Klaus says really, should we be scared that that the total breakdown of this rules-based global order could be imminent?
If I may, Thomas, I'll answer this question, but maybe just reacting, quickly to, the comments that the Commissioner made, and it's encouraging to know and hear that, especially in the EU, there's been a needs-based approach in the provision of humanitarian assistance, and that's really, really very welcome. And I hope that this is going to set an example and precedence for many countries around the world who have used and are using humanitarian assistance as part of their foreign policy. Hence, we struggle, and that's why you see also the huge discrepancies in terms of the assistance and the funding that is channeled, for instance, to Ukraine, versus a crisis that is currently unfolding in Sudan and the challenges that we're facing to mobilize funds for refugees moving out of Sudan to all of the neighboring countries. So a plea to again replicate and capitalize on this good example for other countries and other member states. And that's why your voices, our collective voices, are quite critical to ensure that this happens. Because other than Sudan, as you mentioned, Klaus, also in the Sahel, in the Horn, Yemen, these are the humanitarian DPRK, North Korea. No one talks about North Korea. No one talks about North Korea. And if my memory serves me well, when I used to cover North Korea a number of years ago, Around 80% of the population in North Korea are in need of humanitarian assistance, but we don't talk about it. All that we talk about are the political aspects of the crisis. We talk about the sanctions that need to be imposed for political reasons. So there is also a critical role for us to play, to advocate with the sanctions committee, with other member states, to make sure that there are humanitarian exemptions and we preserve our ability to be able to deliver assistance in countries such as North Korea. Just to give you an example, with the sanctions and the issue around sanctions and counterterrorism legislation, all of which have unintended consequences on vulnerable communities and humanitarian action. These are critical issues and are determined by legislation, whether it is, again, on the continent here or the US or the UN sanctions also set up that we have. In the case of North Korea, we have been challenged to get cash into the country so that the humanitarian organizations are able to pay salaries of their staff, to buy fuel so that we can use the vehicles, to pay electricity, and in some cases we had to actually carry cash by hand in suitcases to be able to address these basics, to be able to deliver assistance there. And even when we negotiate exemptions, because we had the chance to brief, for instance, the sanctions committee, to provide these exemptions for humanitarian action, it still does not help out because you have many companies, many corporations around the world that are conservative and are worried about providing assistance or providing the supply or the logistics to get urgently needed medical supplies or food, because there would be consequences by the financial institutions if they were to cooperate and deliver assistance there. So just something, again, that is quite important to highlight and put the spotlight on here. Yes, I mean, absolutely. There are concerns around the current governance structures. I think it is important, as humanitarians, because most of us here and most of those also online are humanitarians, it's important to go back to basics. As humanitarian workers, our goals, our responsibilities, our unnegotiables are very clear. It is to save lives and reduce suffering. And we will do whatever it takes, and we must do whatever it takes to ensure that this is achieved, because communities affected by crisis are relying on us to be their champions, to be their voice, to be their advocates, to make sure that they're protected and assisted. I'll stop here, Thomas.
Yes, thank you so much. And Christos, please. Christos, please allow me. We have set up this panel intentionally to be kind of a foundational, talking about principles, but allow me to go into the specifics, because we talk about the role that the European Union plays, and you are a Greek citizen, and we just, there is this wonderful picture of Europe that we have, that we tell ourselves, but at least yesterday and today there is a dark cloud hanging over that, and maybe my pride to be a European is a bit clouded by the fact that, hundreds of people, we don't even know the exact figures yet, died on the shores of Europe. And sorry to be asked about a specific issue, but I think everybody expects, especially knowing that MSF has been active in the Mediterranean, is still active with the rescue operations, taking these, this imperative, keeping that in mind, keeping in mind you're a doctor. What went wrong?
What went wrong?
Yes, I will.
Yes, not just as a Greek citizen, not just as a doctor or a European citizen, but as a citizens of this world, we've been seeing the consequences of what is happening and on people in the move since long time now. And we've been there with MSF, with many other movements of solidarity, not only in the Greek islands. We've been doing search and rescue. We are in the Mexican borders with US. We are in Calais. We are in Tanzanian camps. We're in all those places where people flee to seek safety from other places where we are also there, and even our hospitals are getting bombed. So it is a matter of seeking safety for them and their families. What MSF was trying to say since the very first reception crisis of people on the move back in 2016 is that we need to find more dignified ways of treating the people. We need to treat people with dignity and ensure that their lives are safe. And we didn't jump into a political discussion about who has the right to be here, there, or wherever. But it was all about treating people with dignity and respecting their lives. We noticed that the European Union policies, the last many years, have adopted a different approach. And the paradigm is about securitizing. It's a lot about security. It is a narrative that we see also within the European citizens. And it is a practice now, outsourcing, you know, these tough work and jobs to others outside, like Libya, which is unimaginable to me. If you had ever the opportunity to be there and see how those detention centers are, what is the role of the Libyan Coast Guard in all this, you couldn't sleep at night. We do the same now in the UK with the Rwanda, and we have done this with Turkey. And the more obstacles you put on the route of those people that they want to flee desperate from their places, you don't prevent this from happening, but you create more dangerous routes. And this is what has been happening today, not only in Europe. It happens everywhere. In Europe, we experienced also something else that we didn't touch upon before, and it was one of the other talking points I had, and was the only one that was not mentioned by the Commissioner, about also the criminalization of aid and the counter-terrorism laws that they seem to supersede many times the international humanitarian law. Actually, in Europe, we don't see exactly that, but we have been several times penalized of doing the very basic act of helping other people. We have been stopped several times from doing search and rescue activities for several different pretenses, but we know at the end of the day that there are many times arguments and opportunities by the European policies against the humanitarian aid itself. So this is not the solution. We need to shift the paradigm. After this and after so many people getting drowned in the Mediterranean Sea, we have to look at it differently. And I do understand and respect that security can be a part of the agenda, but where is humanity? Maybe by looking at it more, we can have better outcomes in the future.
Mm. Yes. Thank you, Janis. I hear you have to go to appointments with humanitarian organization representatives, you know, successful discussions, fruitful discussions, and thanks a lot for joining us here on the panel.
Thank you.
Yes, and also Christos, thanks a lot for your contribution here.
I have also another point. Sorry, I forgot it now, because it was about, yes, the global responsibility, which is a nice concept, indeed. I would say the collective responsibility to respond and stand in solidarity towards the people around the world. And we are just out of a pandemic that can teach us a lot about this. What does it mean, collective responsibility towards a world that is under stress? And of course, we shared several good words about standing in solidarity and treating all the products, the outcomes of science, like the vaccines, as common goods. But that never happened in the reality at the end of the day. So let us go back there and understand what went wrong and what we can do better next. I would love to see the solidarity that Europeans and the whole world has shown to our human fellows from Ukraine. It is amazing. I would like to see that for everybody. And I would also like to see more proportional distribution of the humanitarian aid. And I don't blame, of course, any of the organizations that they don't have the funds to allocate them proportionally. I cannot blame, for example, an organization that has 250 million euros per year in Ukraine and only 8 million in Haiti, which is the completely chaotic situation in the world these days. But there are donors. There are states behind that they choose that. And there is where we have to focus now and change their mindset. Mm.
I think, Ariane, this is a very interesting point. Do you see that also within the ICRC, that there is this, let's say, bias, that some crises are more important than others? Then, in fact, that means some humans are more valuable than others. Is that something that you see also, that you have discussions, that this is what's going on?
Absolutely. Unfortunately, it is. As much as you know, we perhaps see budgets growing over the last years in humanitarian aid. Looking ahead, we might see a reverse trend, unfortunately. That's perhaps also something to discuss. But I think the fact that humanitarian aid budgets are increasingly earmarked, that's a technical term from donors to say, we want you to spend this money in this context, on this activity, is for us something that hinders actually a needs-based response. It means that that humanitarian organizations increasingly will direct their activities to where the money is. And that money may indeed be driven there by political interests. In the case of ECHO, we're really fortunate that they are really separating their humanitarian agenda from the political one. And perhaps Mr. Lenacic just left, but I think what the EU has done also with regards to humanitarian exemptions that Mervat was mentioning is also extremely important. So I think, yes, the flexibility is needed. We need to be able to respond where the needs are and not to become part of a political agenda.
Mm. Yeah, but what you just said, the two of you, makes me think, because I don't know here in the room, but very often now it happens that when you donate, you give maybe money on Instagram, click a link, or on Twitter or on social media, and usually it's campaign, the impulse comes from a campaign for Ukraine, for the earthquake in Turkey or in Syria. So I think that is something that we should really bear in mind, that all of us, when we donate, even as individuals, just give the money. Don't say here or there because organizations know best. A good point. Mm. Thank you for that contribution. A very important point. And Klaus, again, this point of the humanitarian imperative. Why is it, and what can we do? We just heard the problem of the earmarking. We heard the problem of that some crises are more important, so to speak, than others. We will have another panel on what role the media plays in it, or what role campaigning plays in that, in just the panel after the next panel. But what do you think? Is there a way out for that? That we basically look at the problem and say, okay, where is the need? How can we most efficiently use the money that we have, the resources that we have? And how can we also maybe distribute the loads? What is a neighborhood problem that the neighbors should take care of? Haiti is not in our neighborhood. So in the Western Hemisphere, maybe they have more responsibility. Or is it, and also Janis said that, the whole planet is our neighborhood. Basically, any crisis everywhere is something that we should take responsibility for and do something if we can.
Obviously, in this room, I think everybody feels that every human life has the same value, irrespective of where they are on the globe. Mm. This is what unites us. But that's not how everybody sees it. So, and politics is here to stay. Let's not be naive. What we can do as humanitarians is to document the needs, to make very clear that the hungry child in Juba or in the cholera-infected people in Haiti, they are there, they exist. We put the numbers on the table so that the politics have to answer. Why did they diverge? They will diverge, trust me. It's a battle. But it's not without political costs to diverge too much. So, and you heard what the commissioner said. He was very fast in making the case that we are not sinners, we are trying, etc. And this is exactly what has to happen. So it's our responsibility to actually document the needs in a fair and independent way. And this has come a long way, notably by OCHA. Others are bringing all the numbers there and putting the facts in front of the people. And then I do agree that there is an underfunding issue, a huge one, and I'm absolutely scandalized when I see big pharmaceutical companies, big high-tech companies just harvesting the funds from the COVID vaccines or harvesting the funds of our kids every time they click on Google. There is the publicity machine that generates profits, and this sits somewhere out there in the economic world, and they pretend that they don't have a responsibility to take care of the humanitarian caseload. I mean, what's going on? Again, this is very political, but I think we all have to think about these things. How is the wealth distributed, and what can be done about it? So,
may I just interrupt you there, Klaus? Because what I hear you say when you say that, it means, why don't we have some sort of a Tobin tax or some kind of whatever, is it financial transactions, cross-border, whatever that we have, and maybe even put a fund to say, well, we have a global tax, and maybe we put that money in a fund, in a global fund, where we could, you know, maybe take some of these.
Well, Thomas, that's exactly what
That's what you're saying,
exactly,
right?
Exactly. I'm not naive. I mean, we have tried the Tobin tax for ages. Thomas Piketty has proposed something similar. And this is what I alluded to when I said, be prepared for the new governance model. Because we all understand interdependence. We all understand that if the kid is not vaccinated against COVID in Burkina Faso, then there is a risk for us. If climate action is not being taken actively in sub-Saharan Africa, there will be refugees. So we have global common goods. And with the understanding of interdependence, fatally, we will have to have this kind of system of financing the global commons in one way or the other. But it may be through a very painful birth, as some of our women will realize. Good comes out of pain, isn't it?
But also what you have said, could it be that, for instance, let's take the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, a substantial donor, right? Bill Gates founded Microsoft. He's exactly founded one of these global companies, and then, you know, post-career Microsoft, he did that. Is that a solution, you think, that these super billionaires take this responsibility, or would you rather see kind of, again, some sort of global fund where you just tax whatever cross-border financial transaction, whatever it might be?
I'm sorry, Tom. We need everything.
Yeah.
Everybody have been on the deck. Everybody. There's an urgency. And they are not all like Bill Gates. Some of them are not giving anything, or they finance Trump or other funny stuff. Okay? I'm a little bit angry. I mean, come on. Let's solve these problems.
Yeah. I like this panel. Nobody's sugarcoating things. That's fantastic. In that spirit, Mervat, please.
Yes. So yeah, just to say that I couldn't agree with you more, Klaus. I think there's no magic bullet. I think it's about innovation and being creative and using whatever is available to make sure that we're able to close that gap between needs and resources. And by the way, on the global funds part, in case colleagues are not aware, there is a fund called the Central Emergency Response Fund, which is managed by the UN, by OCHA. that aims to achieve just that, and also others that are country-based pool funds for that purpose. But that's why I'm saying there are many tools that are available and that we need to tap upon to make sure that we close this supply and demand. I think the other point which is important, and I see it as well in our world, within the Interagency Standing Committee and the humanitarian, sector, is that we always talk about the importance of engaging with other key actors and stakeholders, including the private sector, including development actors, including IFIs. But we are always we're speaking to ourselves, so it's like we're speaking to the converted already. And I would hope we have a responsibility within the UN and OCHA to do more of that. And I would hope also in future congresses in Vienna that will also be able to bring the others to the room. So it's great to see medias here, academics, the UN, NGOs, but let's also bring the development actors, let's bring in the banks, let's bring in the private sector, because the private sector is doing a lot. And we might not see it, and of course our spotlight is usually on the big multinational corporations, rightly so, because they make huge profits, and as a result they have also bigger responsibilities. But there is an initiative that emerged from the World Humanitarian Summit a couple of years ago. We were talking about it yesterday, called the Connecting Business Initiative. And in different countries around the world and different regions, private companies that might not be known globally are doing amazing work when it comes to meeting the needs of communities affected by crisis. In Bangladesh, Myanmar, when the refugee crisis happened, it were host communities, it was the small shops and companies on the ground that provided mobile phones, that provided distributed food assistance to the refugees when they crossed the border. It were the doctors on the ground. So it's just important to recognize that there's a lot happening. Maybe we're not giving it as much spotlight as we should, but we need to also recognize that. The last point that I want to maybe mention is around bringing all stakeholders around the table is also bringing the community voice. We, of course, are all humanitarians, and we believe that we're doing our best to relay the voices and the needs of communities. But there is still a huge gap between what communities are asking for and what we're delivering. Again, going back to the World Humanitarian Summit, the first ask of all communities, and we consulted with thousands of communities affected by crisis around the world, is end conflict. End conflict, and that was the point of the summit, is to highlight to political leaders around the world that they have a particular responsibility to reduce needs and end suffering by ending conflict. But equally as well, in most of the crises around the world, most of them, unfortunately, are protracted crises. As we all know, most of the internally displaced around the world, on average, have been displaced for over a decade. On average, it's actually 17 years where you have people, vulnerable people, displaced in camps. It was very heartbreaking to have gone to Cox's Bazar a number of years ago when the more recent influx of almost 1 million people happened from Myanmar, from Rakhine State to Cox's Bazar. And we had the chance to also visit some of the refugees that were there for 20 years and still living in tents. Still living in tents. So there are humanitarian needs, and we need to be able to provide life-saving assistance and protection. But at the same time, these communities are asking for a lot more than that. They're asking for education for their kids. Just as we all want our kids to get the best education, they also want a future and hope for their kids. They're asking for livelihood. They want to work. They don't want to rely on humanitarian assistance. They're asking for cash, for dignity, to be able to choose. Maybe I'll choose to buy a textbook for my son rather than buying, a bag of rice. So these are some of the things that we need to be aware of, and I know that we'll be able to address them more as a unit, as collaborating and engaging and cooperating with other critical stakeholders that need to be in the room. So,
I feel like we are singing in an opera every time we have a crescendo. And then but well said, indeed, because we need more people. We need a broader spectrum to have these conversations. We need the philanthropies. However, I'm not convinced that they can change the world. We need the developers. We need everyone to be there But the humanitarians need to be well coordinated and well prepared for these conversations, protecting the humanitarian space. Because what I see today, and let us bring back the discussion about nexus that was mentioned also by the Commissioner, we see that we try to do everything at the same time, and even with the best intentions, at the end we don't do anything. And sometimes, which is not the good scenario, we find ourselves being manipulated, instrumentalized in all these things. So the humanitarian space needs to be protected and come first, to my opinion. And of course, even us, that we have been several times questioned and criticized the triple nexus, we see the necessity in some places. I've been in Yemen a month ago. I talked to the people in a kind of post-war situation at the moment. And one of the main problems that they have now is that there's no one there to pay the salaries of demotivated health workers for many, many years. And I don't mention all other things, but this to me is important. So yes, let's have this conversation together. But the humanitarian space should not be hijacked in all this conversation. And there are even new trends coming now that they are worrying me about treating humanitarian assistance as a way, as the route to go to peace. We should be very cautious with these things.
But I think the point on the humanitarian principles, which is the reason why we're here today, is essential. You know, without those, and that needs to be understood, and we perhaps need to also explain better why they are so key to states, but also to private donors. And we see that also in conversations at the ICRC with philanthropy, that, you know, they have very specific interests that sometimes don't necessarily serve what we are able to do, and what the people need in the end on the ground. Speaking of one of the central principles is neutrality. I think in today's increasingly polarized world, we really see that the understanding of why humanitarian organizations are neutral is under strain. We're being accused of, you know, neutrality, meaning that you don't care, that you're closing your eyes in front of the suffering, whereas it needs to be understood that this neutrality, this very neutrality, is what allows us in the end to be able to go you know, to the most difficult places in order to help the people, to spend time there with them, to discuss, to have access to people across front lines, to be able to evacuate people across front lines. We were discussing with MSF last night how, you know, at times we also team up when we're present on different sides of the front line in order really to bring people to safety and to medical care. It's what allows us specifically as ICRC to have access to prisoners of war, for instance, on the other side. So those are, you know, tasks that were given to the humanitarian community by states initially, speaking of international humanitarian law. The principles were developed in order to facilitate the ask that we get from states. And I think that also needs to be very much part of the conversation.
So two things that I take away from this round is, number one, very important. I think it was a lot of interesting inputs. Maybe next year, somebody from the private sector should sit here. There should be an involvement of social entrepreneurs that are also, it's huge. There's a huge movement. I know that a lot of you are actually, you know, tap into these brains that are there. So basically, Homo Davosiensis, Davos man from the World Economic Forum, they should be involved. I think it's very important. And again, the earmark question that maybe the philanthropists that have these specific, the specific targeting, maybe they should also kind of set aside a part of the budget to say, okay, this is, again, like what we said, we should donate basically without any Syria or Ukraine, maybe they should do the same. That's an important takeaway. And again, it's great you brought us back to the topic, the base topic of our discussion, and that means our humanitarian principle that should be impartiality, neutrality, and humanity. That's what it is. And again, that's under question sometimes, right?
And it will be even more, because Mervat mentioned also something other. It has to be brought to our attention, the community engagement and how important it is. And also in many places where we cannot go, maybe others can, like local civil society organizations. And we have such experiences in Syria, in Ukraine, doing cross-border activities. And we don't expect from them to have the same principles like us, of course. Where is neutrality there, maybe, or impartiality? But still, when you know that some people will get their medicine, it is also an important thing to have in mind when you draw your strategies there.
Can I say something, maybe just to react
Please.
on that? And I think it speaks to the point, Klaus, that you've mentioned earlier, which is the humanitarian principles are ingrained in all religions and faiths and belief systems that are in the world. And sometimes I feel that, especially when the localization debate, about engaging with local actors or channeling more resources and sharing capacities. I don't like the capacity building point. It's more capacity sharing between local actors and internationals. That there tends to be a sentiment that maybe they're not as principled, or maybe they don't hold the same principle. And I know, I'm sure there are organizations around the world that might not share the same principles. But I think it's also important to realize that many of them do. So, and that speaks also about our humility as an international system, because when we're speaking to different groups and being humble in terms of our engagement with different governments or civil society or communities affected by crisis or whatever, it is important to understand the context and the culture and speak the language based on the culture. The most important thing is the end point, and the end point is to reduce suffering and reduce and save lives. So if it means that we're fair to the Bible and quotes from the Bible, to be able to speak and hit a chord and resonate with the communities or with civil society or governments to be able to deliver that, then that's the language we have to use. If it means that we quote verses from the Quran for the same reason, then that is the language we have to use, because sometimes, whether it's right or wrong, sometimes the branding of humanitarian principles, although they're all ingrained within all faiths and cultures and beliefs, sometimes they are viewed as Western concepts. But if you really, when you unpack it and when you speak about it and explain it, and that's part of our role in terms of raising awareness and understanding and creating empathy and seeing that we're all human beings that share the same values, that's when we're able to bridge, these divides. And then on the funding issue, and it speaks again to localization, there is a business proposition or a value proposition, if I may say so, in terms of capitalizing on local organizations that are at the front line delivering assistance. It costs less, they know the context, they're well accepted. So we have to also look at that also from in terms of a cost-benefit analysis as well, not just in terms of the fact that it's actually happening and they're at the front line and in many cases much better accepted than many of the international interventions. And then the last point is, and I couldn't agree with you more, Christos, absolutely. I don't think it has to be an either-or. The humanitarian principles are unnegotiable. They provide us as humanitarians with a moral compass and an ethical framework. They are unnegotiable. But it doesn't mean that we cannot also be creative and be agile to better understand the context and the world that we live in. As you mentioned, Klaus, we are living in a highly political environment. Humanitarian action in many instances, especially by governments, is political. So we can preserve humanitarian space and respect humanitarian principles and at the same time understand the other parties that we're engaging with to make sure that we achieve our shared goal as humanitarians in terms of saving lives and reducing, never lose sight of that. Saving lives, reducing suffering. Saving lives, reducing suffering. Unnegotiable. What is it going to take It's not always a straightforward path, which is arriving in a place and holding the flag of only the humanitarian principles, but it's important. That's part of the principles of partnership and collaboration or engagement, is understanding the other party and figuring out what is it that's going to get the message across to them, that access to communities affected by crisis, that protection of civilians is not a nice to have, it's a must and it's an obligation.
Before I hand over to Klaus, I dare to be a little bit provocative, if I may. And that is, of course, you spoke about localization and all the rest of it, but still, sometimes in some areas, the locals see humanitarians come in. Either there is a white caravan plane landing on some airstrip with the big letters UN written on them, or then that's a white guy like myself would drive in a Land Cruiser and come out with a nice shiny vest, whereas I have just maybe a little T-shirt that's all ripped up. How do we deal with that? Because there is still, and I know it's a discussion that you're all having, and you already stated how you can address it, but there's still this kind of neo-colonial, sometimes, yeah, the neo-colonial aspect of it, that the local communities sometimes feel it's like, okay, like the Brits riding in all over again sometimes. How can we address that? And sorry to be provocative, but I know that you're having these debates amongst us yourselves, but I think it's still an important question.
Thomas, you make me feel very ashamed, because I have also been there, with the funny hat and the echo all over.
Yeah, the journalists are even, we are there, the same, look at it just the same. We even compared to you guys more useless. So, but we've all been there, right? We've all been there.
It is scandalous that, what is it, 8 years after the World Humanitarian Summit, where we committed to put 25% of the funding through local organizations. And then some funny government added the words, as far as possible, or something. There's a little wiggle room. That's why we are at below 2% today. This is scandalous. Mm-hmm. So we have to have a very good look in the mirror. What are we asking our lovely NGOs, our UN guys to do? Just to come and help? Or to build a minimum of capacity, interact with the locals, decode the language? I completely agree with what Mervat said about using the words, putting them into context, speaking the language of their religion, linking up to, their value systems. This has not been given sufficient priority, because also I have to say, very often our taxpayers, they want to know how many bags of food have you delivered. They are not aware that in order to be efficient, you actually better let the recipients provide the food themselves, helped by capacity building. So there is a very difficult issue here, and I think we need a serious discussion about localization, not just blah blah, but something really serious. I read a report just 2 days ago from another organization where I'm working. Not to hide anything, Norwegian Refugee Council, I love to work with them. They had produced a study. In one of the chapters on localization, they said, listen to this, there is a fear among our staff that they will be superfluous. Hello. So it means that some of our own collaborators actually a little bit skeptical. Where's my job going? I mean, we have to move up the value chain. We have to do capacity building and really help, but be serious about it. So I want to stop here. I have other things to say, but that's maybe.
Yes, please.
Yeah, perhaps just to add to that. some points to what Klaus just said. I think where we have tried to move forward now in the last years as ICRC is in terms of diversification also of our staff, and to bring in people from different cultures, to involve more local, to also promote local colleagues to get more responsibilities within the organization, instead of jetting in international staff. As Red Cross, Red Crescent movement, we of course also have our local partners on the ground, the local Red Crescent or Red Cross national societies. And I think here we also, we consider them our preferred local partners. And I think, they face numerous challenges as well, in terms of indeed having the right capacities. We see it in many countries where money flows in. The UN, us, everybody turns towards local organizations and also very often the national societies, but they don't have the capacities, the internal structures to really be able to absorb all of this. The reporting requirements are sometimes huge. They don't have perhaps the governance structures. So we really need to, as you say, build their capacities, to invest in them in order to make them strong actors on the ground. I think for local organizations, principles we just mentioned, we're talking about neutrality. For a local actor to be neutral in a conflict zone is extremely difficult, it's complicated. And they need also our backup in order to live up as much as possible to those standards that we have within our sector.
That's a very complex issue about decolonizing and modernizing the humanitarian aid today and actually making it agile and efficient enough. I think the solution should not be the regionalization, the localization. It can be part of the solution, and I understand very much how important it is to engage with the communities or to look the potential that local civil society organizations can have. But the importance of always having international presence as a message of standing in solidarity to those most neglected crises around the world should always be there. Because I see sometimes we move very easily from one edge to the other, and having understood how colonial we have been in our modus operandi the last year, we want to move to the other edge, and this is also very dangerous. That's my drama, leading a big organization that has gone, as many others, through the Black Lives Matter, through several diversity, equity, and inclusion issues, and we have to understand that the route is painful, of course. It is long. There is a journey there that we have all started and will take time. And while moving with this and trying to diversify our teams more, which is the right thing to do, we are also confronted with new problems. Today, for MSF, we indeed have 50% of our coordinators in the different operations that they come from what we call the Global South. But they come from countries where there is a male dominance. And we ended up having such an unacceptable gender imbalance in a humanitarian system that it was already very patriarchal. So there is a lot of work to do there, first of all, in this humanitarian system itself. And this will be we will see the fruits coming in a longer term. But let us not move from one edge to the other, I think.
Just to say, I couldn't agree with you more, Christos. And I don't think anyone is arguing that it has to be one extreme or the other. Absolutely, protection by presence is absolutely essential in many of the contexts that we're operating. But there are also many other contexts where maybe that might not be needed, especially in natural disaster contexts, maybe in some of the protracted crisis contexts. So I agree with you. It's not, one extreme or the other. And I think, I was, quite struck when I was speaking to one of, the small civil society organizations in Gaziantep in Turkey, because of course, at that time, as international organizations, international NGOs and UN, we weren't able to access, and we're not able to access Northwest Syria. But guess who's delivering the assistance there? Yeah. It is the local NGOs headed by Syrian refugees in Gaziantep that are crossing the border, delivering assistance and confronting all sorts of challenges, including risking their lives to be able to deliver assistance to their country mates who are displaced and living in extremely difficult circumstances in northwest Syria. And one thing that they said is, that's why I'm moving completely away from using terms, sorry to say, such as capacity building, because it's assuming that local NGOs don't have the capacity. On the contrary, they have a lot of capacity. The whole point is between the marriage, if I can say so, between international and local is complementarities. So what are the areas that we need to learn from them? What are the areas that we need to empower them more to do? And vice versa. So it's not a one-way street or journey. It's a mutually beneficial relationship. It's an equal partnership. Otherwise, it's not called a partnership. It's a transaction, and that's not good. The second thing is also, again, to your point, Klaus, about the World Humanitarian Summit, 25% of funds, that was a goal to go to local NGOs, now less than 2%, extremely alarming, disappointing, 7 years after the World Humanitarian Summit that this is where we're at. But again, I want to also talk about some of the positives, because it's easy to sort of get lost in this debate with some of the negatives and the challenges that we're facing. But just to give you an example, for the pooled funds that OCHA is managing, 25% indeed. We've met that target of 25% pooled funds are going to local NGOs, especially with the country-based pool funds. And we just need to see more of that happening. We're nowhere where we need to be as a collective and as a system, but it's important, again, to put the spotlight and learn from the lessons of those who are able to do it, because it demonstrates the proof of concept that it can be done. It can be done, and it's working. Sorry. There was one more point that I wanted to say here. So the issue of like the localization as well, and I hear it a lot also from especially international NGOs, that actually the majority of their staff on the ground are local staff. And just to give you a sense, when it comes to attacks against humanitarian workers, just to give you also the sense of how difficult, of course, the operating environment has been, the attacks against humanitarian workers jumped from 280, those being attacked in 2015, to over 490 staff in 2020, I believe. So the figures, of course, are much higher now. Over 95% of those that are attacked are nationals, are national staff. So it's important, again, to recognize the important local capacity and knowledge, and that's why we have to not only empower civil society, but also empower and promote and put national staff in the driver's seat and in managerial positions to be able to, again, bring the international and the national discourse closer, to each other. Thank you
so much. Yeah. At this point, I would like to invite you in the audience to grab a microphone and ask your questions, and please wait for the microphone, because we are streaming, so that the audience that's online can also hear you. Yes, I think we already have. Yes, please introduce yourself first, and please wait for the microphone. Thank you so much. Go ahead.
Thank you very much for this thought-provoking panel discussion. My name is Tigran Zakarian from the Armenian Embassy. Some of the hotspots with urgent humanitarian need were mentioned at this panel, but I want to draw your attention to the dire humanitarian situation unfolding in Nagorno-Karabakh as a result of the illegal blockade by Azerbaijan for more than 6 months now. ICRC faces itself huge obstacles and challenges in transporting humanitarian assistance to Nagorno-Karabakh, and it is alarming to know that since yesterday all the transportation of humanitarian assistance was banned by Azerbaijan. And so now the people in Nagorno-Karabakh are living in a complete siege with lack of medicine, food, with hundreds of emergency surgeries being impossible and already causing deaths. So my question is, how can we raise awareness to mobilize the international community to increase the pressure against Azerbaijan, to safeguard international access of relevant agencies, UN agencies, to Nagorno-Karabakh, because the humanitarian need of the people is really urgent. Thank you.
Thank you very much. But I would also just remind everybody that at 2 o'clock after the lunch break, we will have another session, Forgotten Crisis, Forgotten Suffering. I'm sure these topics will come up there as well, but nevertheless, please, anybody wants to address it? Yeah.
Well, I can perhaps start. I mean, indeed, we have a presence in Nagorno-Karabakh already since 1994. And you know, speaking of forgotten crises and funding, perhaps it's only because of unearmarked funding that we were able to be present in the region for the last 30 years, to keep a presence with local staff, but also international staff. And in 2020, we were able to respond from the very first hours of the conflict that was unfolding then. I mean, the situation is extremely complex, and going back to one of the very first statements today, that humanitarian crises cannot be solved with, or political crises cannot be solved with humanitarian aid. I think here we are at the center of the issue. We as humanitarian organization are present there. We are negotiating every day to be able to carry out our activities, to be able to evacuate people, to be able to reunify families. You know, that's something that we will never let go of. But in the end, it's really a political solution that needs to be found.
And maybe negotiating access in these places, traditionally speaking, as organizations, we've been doing that, trying to find people in those old traditional hubs and centers, but maybe there are new interlocutors. Maybe we need to move outside Geneva, London, New York, and find those places and those new, let's say, want to become humanitarian hubs, and start interacting with these people. And they may help us negotiate access to places like the one you mentioned, a context that it's extremely political, to my opinion.
Thanks. More questions? Yes, here. And again, join us at 2 o'clock for the Forgotten Crisis session. We will talk more about this, the topic.
Thank you. This is a fantastic panel, and there's so much to ask, so many comments one can make. I have to say I liked very much Klaus's point about empathy, and also that it was associated a little bit with anger. So this is not my basic question, but I have a question of where is the role of outrage here? Because I think we are sort of depleting our supply of outrage when we see the 700 in Greece, when we see the violations of IHL. I ask myself, why are we not more outraged? Because these are fundamental tenets. You bomb hospitals, come on. And we are not on the streets in front of the embassies protesting this. But this was not my basic point. My basic point was that I subscribe to all you're saying about localization and that we should use local resources. On the other hand, I fear that some people might interpret what you're saying as though we should have a bad conscience, that we are trying to do good. This is a very dangerous perspective, something which is deeply associated with tribal thought, etc., etc. But I think that in this context, and in all contexts, we must learn to look at not who we are, but what we are.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Klaus. Outrage in a time of polycrisis.
No, I mean, don't get me going on that one. Let's go to the embassy, and I can pick a few embassies that we should go to. This is for sure. But it is actually, I wonder, I think our kids are looking at their iPhones and they're communicating with each other instead of going to the embassies. There's something funny going on in our societies, the way we express ourselves and so on. Nobody should be ashamed of doing the right thing. And localization is not because we are ashamed of being old colonizers. I mean, you have the whole debate about decolonization, so we all have to feel ashamed that we have an opinion, etc. No. I think we are legitimate in pointing to a track record, coming all the way back from Solferino, and maybe even before. A lot of good stuff has been done. We have to find a way, in a respectful way, to transmit that knowledge, and with pride and with compassion, of course. but not do it. What I see, unfortunately, is that it's not really happening at the speed it should be happening. And there, perhaps, we should feel a little bit guilty that we're not doing what we have decided to do. So let's go for it. You don't like capacity. I have to scrap that from my vocabulary.
No, capacity building.
Capacity, yeah, okay.
Capacity sharing.
No capacity. No, but I mean, I think we understand each other. The way you transmit is almost as important as what you transmit, because if it's not understood, it doesn't work. So there has to be a partnership. But we have to do it. We have to do it. And it is also about efficiency and costs and local agency. So this enthusiasm has to be transmitted and done in a partnership. I think we can do it. So you want to know the name of the embassy?
I think in the back, yeah, hands are going up all over. Please, I saw 3 of them. Yes, please. Thank you so much.
Hi, everyone. That is a great discussion, so thank you for all the insights. I'm Imran Khan. I'm working for the German Leprosy and Tuberculosis Relief Association in Germany. My question, I will start with the line that we said that all humans are equal. So that's quite an interesting statement, but I think I never saw anyone talk about Afghanistan the whole morning. So I think that is something we have to think about it, that Afghanistan is also a forgotten conflict, and how can we deal with that? My question is more on us, that in the feminist principles, we are self-aware and we are also accountable. I'm asking the biggest stakeholders, what is the accountability mechanism with you when things don't go right, or things are not working? How can we make you accountable, for example, UN and other bigger stakeholders? What is that? What is the mechanism in that? The second question I have is that we often say, as a humanitarian actors, that we are not political, we don't have to involve in the political discussions. But I think as a humanitarian activist, I also feel that political solutions are important. And how do we go along with it, that we really also seek some political political conflicts are there, because we cannot be there forever and saying we'll just help with the humanitarian solutions, but we will not touch upon on the political solution. So I think that mapping of the stakeholders are also very important, that we also put some pressure internationally as well to solve some of the conflicts which are solvable, to my understanding. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. Thanks for this question. Yeah, maybe on the point of Afghanistan, and thanks for highlighting Afghanistan, because obviously it's one of the big elephants in the room, especially, I mean, for me it also strikes a particular personal point to me, because one of my first UN job was with the World Food Programme in 2002, and it started in Afghanistan, in Mazar al-Sharif and northwest Afghanistan. And it was quite heartbreaking to see 20 years later, you know, that we're pretty much back to the point that we were at. And it just speaks about, again, the challenges, you know, that we're facing in terms of geopolitics and global governance, you know, structures and the challenges in finding solutions to these types of issues long term. But especially on the issue of women in Afghanistan. So this is yeah, I mean, this is a really challenging one. You know, and it goes back to the point of not losing sight of the target and what's the objective. And our objective as humanitarians and as an international community is to make sure that assistance is provided, protection is provided. Women, girls are able to go back to school, women are able to work. And so there is nuances in terms of how the engagement and the art of humanitarian diplomacy that needs to be borne in mind or kept in mind when these negotiations are taking place. And one of the things that, again, you know, my emergency relief coordinator, who's the Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, I mean, he's got tremendous background in mediation and is around in pushing us as a system to think more creatively around who are the influencers in many of the contexts that we're operating. In many instances, yes, as UN and as INGOs, we are best placed to advocate publicly and speak loudly about violations that are happening. But in many other instances, we might not be the best people to do that publicly. There's a lot that has to happen behind the scenes. There's a lot that has to happen with other influencers that have the ears and the access and the influence over some of these parties to the conflict to be able to effect the change that we need, which is again about saving lives, reducing suffering, girls going back to school in Afghanistan, women being able to work in the humanitarian field, and so on and so forth. So this is just a general point around the importance of humanitarian diplomacy, the art of humanitarian diplomacy, humility in recognizing how are we perceived by many of the parties on the ground, and who is best placed to relay the message to effect the change that we all agree on. So that's maybe one important point. The accountability point is such an important point, and it's a really, really difficult one. And I start maybe with a good, positive story, because I'm trying to bring some positivity to the discussion as well. We're embarking as the UN in partnership again with organizations on what we're referring to as the flagship initiative. This is an initiative that the Emergency Relief Coordinator is pushing forward. We're piloting it in 4 countries: Niger, Philippines, Colombia, and South Sudan. And the idea is to really look at the response in a completely different light. So empowering humanitarian leadership on the ground, to engage with the right local actors on the ground, putting humanitarian communities affected by crisis in the driver's seat to decide what is it that they want, how they want it, from whom they want it. So it's really removing the shackles of very strict or bureaucratic or complex coordination structures for us to be able to deliver based on what communities are relaying, what are their instructions to us as humanitarians. And I'm really optimistic. This has just started this year, and I'm optimistic that we will be able to see the change. And so because the accountability ultimately, as a system, we tend to react to some of the loudest voices. And the loudest voices are usually member states, are usually donors. And the voice that's the most important voice that we have to react to, but there are no consequences when we don't react to it, are the voices of communities affected by crisis. And we have to change that. And we are in the process of doing more and better to achieve that, including through initiatives such as the flagship initiative that I was referring to. But a critical part there as well is, because again, you can sit with communities and they can say, my top needs are education for my kids, cash, and livelihood. But as an organization, when you are receiving funds that are strict in terms of they're earmarked to this particular crisis, to this particular sector, at this particular time, then there's a mismatch between supply and demand. The demand from communities is X, and we're constrained as humanitarian actors because the conditions of funding are very, very strict. And that's why, to Ariana's point, multi-year, quality, unearmarked, flexible funding is an absolute necessity. Yeah.
Thank you so much. We have more hands in the back, the ones that I saw before, and I think a new one as well. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Qingwei Huang. I'm pursuing a PhD study international development study here. This is the hat I'm wearing here today, but I'm also having another hat, which is Deputy Regional Representative for ICWA in MENA region. I know some of you know that, and if you know about the organization, you will know what I'm going to say. I feel a little bit sad, with all respect to the great speakers here, that the voice of local organizations is not here. We are running the risk of talking about them, localization, partnership, negotiation or non-negotiation, but without them being present. So this is actually a suggestion, maybe for the years onwards, that we should bring in more voice from the local organization, local actors, because on top of everything, they are humanitarians themselves. And so this is my first point, and then related to that, actually, I wanted to raise also a point. I'm not sure if it's a question or not, but but we're talking about negotiation here, we're talking about partner here. It doesn't really click, you know, with only one side. So again, this link to, you know, what kind of people we want to, what kind of parties we want to bring here, right? I mean, and also a question of whether us versus whoever we want to bring in this picture are on equal footing and on equal understanding of what really principle of partner is. I mean, I'm sure, you know, into the core of humanity, everyone has, you know, has a sort of like universal understanding of that. But this understanding always comes with the political conditions and also other, you know, vested interests. So yeah, it's a question or maybe it's just a comment. I personally don't have an answer on that. So maybe for any of the panelists who wanted to have a, you know, have a answer on that. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So maybe because she was, no, just to say I couldn't agree with you more, and I think, you know, these are the messages that I've really been trying to hit home in some of my interventions, and I couldn't agree with you more. I think, you know, what I was mentioning, both in the, you know, the bubble of the UN and the Interagency Standing Committee, but also in these important, you know, platforms such as this Congress, it's important to bring the others, you know, so the local voices, community voices, development actors, IFIs, private sector, because these challenges that we're facing cannot be addressed just by us, you know, preaching to ourselves, because we all agree on what needs to be done, but we need the other parties to do their part. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, here in the back, in the very back, I think, and then another one, and maybe yeah. Please.
Good morning, I am Gelsomina, I am Italian, so I'm not far away. I would like to put on your attention, like we always said, what happened in the Mediterranean yesterday in Greece and 2 months ago in Cutro. I would like to ask what can do EC and ONU, UN, to push our government to stop with this unhuman approach to people coming to our Europe with the boat. So we have now in the Mediterranean, it's like a cemetery. So I think it's really, for you, Mediterranean is the sea, like in Greece, like in Italy. Now we have a lot of tourists, but our government is really in a terrible situation. Our unhuman approach is really not to consider Italy an European government, because every day they stop the boat of ONG. So because Mrs. Meloni and Mrs. von der Leyen are very, very friendly, so what can do this institution to stop the situation? Because the dead in the Mediterranean became really a terrible situation. Médecins Sans Frontières have a boat, I don't know. They stop all the boats. They go all around Italy every day. So this is really unsupportable, I think.
Thank you. Christos, do you want to maybe?
No, thank you very much for this. It brings me back to the points that I tried to raise before about shifting the paradigm and moving from securitization, the agenda of Europe, to a new model where we treat people with dignity and we prevent, as we said, all these deaths happening in our shores. Unfortunately, the agenda itself and the narrative that we see in Europe these days is moving more to the what we call extreme right wing, and not only in your country but also in my country, and they seem to be very well aligned these days. How can we change that? We keep bringing the witnesses, we keep bringing strong messages, but I'm afraid that we need our home societies to help more on this. We cannot do that as organizations. I will try to link it also with accountability before. Indeed, there are organizations that they are mandated to do something, and they are held accountable by those that they support them. There are others, like MSF, that they are self-mandated. And this is a problem also sometimes. We cannot hold ourselves accountable to whom? Only maybe to our supporters. That's why we need the societies to be with us. And we try to engage a lot with the communities, but also all the home societies that they support. And there the message is clear. There we communicate and share a lot all these concerns in the same way and the same language and words that you use, because it comes from our guts, from our heart. Maybe we need to do more on that. We call it témoignage, we call it witnessing, it's advocacy, it's communication. Just speak the language of the people that they suffer. And who knows, we hope to a better world when we see all these societies changing the attitude first.
People, I have bad news and I have good news. So let's start with the bad news. This fantastic panel, our time has run out, so I can't even go around the horn for closing statements, but I hope you enjoyed it. That is the bad news. But the good news is the following, that we have a networking break, and I know that all of you want to mingle and also talk amongst each other, and also we want to talk with you, and we have time for that right now. And after that, we meet again at 11:45 for the next panel. So that's another good news, when nature strikes back, humanitarian aid in times of climate change. Then there will be a lunch break, and then I have the honor to sit here again for the Forgotten Crises panel. So, without further ado, I want to thank my panelists, Klaus, Mervat, Ariane, Christos, and also Yanis, I think, who's in his talks. But thank you so much for this fantastic panel. Thanks for the audience, thank you. And I invite you again, questions, the next panel is waiting. But first of all, let's have a networking break and talk and talk and talk again. There's so much more to say. Thank you so much.